The book we're talking about is the Routledge Introduction to American Writers, and on the cover, as you can see, is Emily Dickinson and then Toni Morrison. And Sharone and I had many discussions about this, many. And then we decided that Emily Dickinson represents a writer who, again, was fiercely devoted, passionate about her poetry, but was definitely writing against the grain. I mean, she had very little support, to the extent that even when she inquired of Thomas Higginson about the possibility of publication, he made it clear that it was too soon, premature for her to think of publishing. And she regrouped and took it well. I think it was insulting beyond belief, but she befriended him, and they were lifelong friends, certainly. But she stood out, I think, because she didn't let go of her sense of what she wanted to do. She was fierce in her concentration and her desire to keep on writing no matter what. And that took amazing, amazing courage and amazing commitment. So she really wasn't discovered until well after she was dead, and I would say she has never received the kind of attention that she has in the last 5 or 10 years. She was a middle panel of my first book, American Triptych, in which I outlined very, very carefully this process of how she had to kind of pull herself together after an initial disappointment and prevail. And she was not afraid to rebel against her father, against religious authorities, against traditional standards of sentimental poetry, and she persisted. So we put her there because of that extraordinary independence and, as I said, fierceness of commitment. And I would say Toni Morrison for similar reasons. Dickinson was writing at a time when women really weren't supposed to write in a kind of bold and brave way, and Toni Morrison was writing about matters of race and changing our notions of narrative structure, just as Emily Dickinson changed our notions of poetic structure. Emily Dickinson abandoned rhyme. Toni Morrison abandoned a kind of strict adherence to linear plot, but also brought in so many more voices, which Sharone will talk about, than we'd ever heard before, really, or very rarely heard from.
Toni Morrison has this career that has, spanned decades. I mean, a good chunk of the 20th century and all the 21st century so far. So there's that part of it as well, and all the acclaim and all of those things. And she's also become such a voice. She's a public intellectual now as well. She's so much more than, well, for people who know who she is, so much more than a writer of novels or a writer of theory. I mean, she's been a professor and she's done all these other kinds of things. But she's also, when she was working as an editor, paved the way for so many other writers and really did a huge thing to sort of break apart publishing and make it, frankly, make it less white, which was one of the major battles of the 60s and 70s. And continuing to this day, it's far from over. So in terms of people who've had huge impact, she's certainly someone who's had huge impact as a writer and as an innovator artistically, but also as a figure in American culture.
Over the years, the participants, that is the women writers themselves, have become so much more diverse, so much more complexly located in the culture that we thought there would be a need to rebalance what has been traditionally thought of as the canon, that is the sort of major women writers, or the canon is supposed to be the greatest, the best, and so on and so forth. But there's so many new voices and so many important works that haven't been accounted for that we wanted to put those works in the tradition of the canon itself. And Sharone is someone who really knows a lot about multicultural literature, I think that's safe to say, and really has a passion for creating that kind of equal perspective, equal treatment of this wide range of writers.
One of the things that was really important to me, as Wendy mentioned, is that that the canon, it's not that it's, there's just so much more that could be included, and the opportunity to bring some of these new voices in and bring them into conversation in ways that, and to almost to to present them in a way that didn't call attention to it, but sort of was able to reorient the way that we look at these texts together was a really exciting opportunity, because nobody really knows this history, and there's so much. If you look at the record is incredible. But one of the things that even since we've written it that has seemed even more urgent is that we're in this moment historically now where it seemed urgent when we were writing the book too, but it seems even so much more urgent now, is that this question of what does it mean to be an American, and which is one of the main projects of American literature. This is what literature is answering, and women have always been a part of that conversation, but they haven't always been a part of the way we've talked about the conversation. So it just seems essential now to look at the record and see that American women have always been part of these movements, and that American literature has always been multi-ethnic and multiracial and gender diverse. It always has been that way. It's always been the writing of immigrants, always. It has always been, there have always been queer and bisexual and lesbian and trans women who have been part of these traditions, women with disabilities, many women with disabilities part of these traditions, and also women from a range of spiritual traditions and religious traditions.
And I would say that continuity is crucial to understand. I think that's something that very few people really take in. For example, I don't think most people, even academics, even specialists in American literature, realize, for example, what an important impact Puritan literature and culture and religion had on American culture in general. Those ideas have been taken, secularized, but nevertheless are structurally very much the same. So that, as Sharone says, there are writers of all ages, of all colors, of many, many backgrounds. But if you even take a canonical writer like Anne Bradstreet, her concerns and her preoccupations we see reflected in poetry and literature today. Anne Bradstreet, I mean, arguably is our first American women writer. Puritan came over from England with her father and her husband. They had lived on the Earl of Lincolnshire's estate. She was used to a rather aristocratic life. She had the run of the Earl's library. She comes to the New World. And she said her heart rose. I mean, there were no streets, there were muddy paths, there were, not any of the amenities she was used to. But she was a committed writer, even from the beginning, even as a young girl. She got here, and of course, women weren't supposed to write. I mean, it really was an era when, especially in New England, women were supposed to be seen and not heard. But she wrote, and she continued to day and night, dark hours of the early morning and so forth. And then actually produced The 10th Muse, which is the first book by a woman published in the United States. And yet she couldn't say, here's my book, I want a publisher to publish it. Her brother-in-law had to take it to England, find a publisher, and Anne Bradstreet had to take the role of, I just do this in my spare time, and he had to make it clear that she didn't take any time from her family. So already she was set up as a second-class citizen, and she had many advantages. And then there were many other writers who certainly didn't have the advantages of Bradstreet, who also wrote, and who maybe took a little longer to be discovered, but were certainly part of that literary community.
Certainly women's writing has mostly been very remunerative for their publishers, at least. But it has to be sort of masked in certain ways. It has to have this introduction by these male poets like Anne Bradstreet in her edition saying, well, she's still a very modest woman. She's not overstepping her bounds. Or it has to be a religious text or meant to instruct children or meant to have some kind of moral lesson. And women often found an opportunity for those kinds of things through reform and through protest. That has been an incredibly important part of how women had access to the literary marketplace.
And I'd like to say that dynamic of protest and reform is a deeply American value. I think it's fair to say that just about every movement has taken place by a group separating and then defining an identity, putting it forward in the public arena, and then moving on. So that it's always a matter of kind of working against the grain, writing against the grain, and I think Sharone is absolutely right. That is what most women are doing in really over a several hundred-year period. And I think we don't often realize the importance of the protest and reform dynamic. I think that we see it today in our politics. It's just obvious. And there are many, many groups and You wonder sometimes if they can ever pull together and find common ground. But it happens. It does happen. And it is requiring, though, a process of differentiation and solidification of an identity. And then there's a kind of coming together. And women have really been very, very much a part of this process.
One of our priorities in this book was to, as we said before, to bring some kind of balance that maybe hadn't necessarily been present in the canon before. And in a book of this size, and you're covering 300 and some years, real estate is of course prime. Like that's like the biggest challenge is who do you allocate space to and how, and so trying to balance the canon with all these people that you have to talk about. You can't ignore Edith Wharton, not that you would want to, but you can't ignore you can't ignore Harriet Beecher Stowe, you can't ignore all the people that we've been talking about for decades, but we also wanted to bring in other people who deserved to be in that place as well, and who haven't necessarily been placed on the same footing or have been broken into too many categories, right? So part of the project was trying to give equal place to all of these figures that we felt deserved to be included, that maybe hadn't necessarily, and putting them in conversation in ways that we hadn't necessarily seen before. So
in some sense, the vision of this book is corrective. But I want to put this in historical context. When I was a graduate student, no one taught women writers. I had never once one woman writer in any of my seminars. Not Willa Cather, not Edith Wharton, not Emily Dickinson even. So I think you have to really understand what a long way we've come in really a very few decades in terms of bringing women writers to public consciousness. As Sharone says, rebalancing, giving weight to some of the writers we've never heard of is important. Now, in the long run, that is not to say that, because we know history is a kind of a pressure cooker and a condensing kind of discipline, and over time many people drop out. We know Shakespeare. We don't know, most of us, many of his contemporaries. Shakespeare has lasted. 400 years from now, perhaps they'll remember Emily Dickinson, perhaps Edith Wharton or Willa Cather, but they will know that it was a very complicated literary ecology. And in this process of rediscovery and reassessment, we discover writers who really are brilliant, who just for one reason and another got overlooked in this sort of political, as I said, pressure cooker. So I think in order to appreciate this book, you have to realize that this information, this knowledge was simply not accessible even 3 decades ago. And this is an effort to bring all the material forward, put it in perspective as seems appropriate, and then future generations will go and reassess, and that's what scholars do.
And they'll move the bar somewhere else.
That's right. That's right.
And they will discover new texts and find their own priorities. And I mean, if you think of your generation as a generation that comes before mine, you know that what you guys did was, beginning 30 and 40 years ago, to bring all of these things to light and bring these works so that we do have Willa Cather, we have a canon of women writers. Yes. So that I didn't come into school, we still read mostly men in many of my classes, but I didn't come into school never having heard of a woman writer. Right. I discovered Anne Bradstreet in high school and was wowed by it. I didn't discover Jane Johnson Schoolcraft. And now maybe the generation that comes after me will, which would be incredibly exciting.
I think we don't realize that writers are really a product of their time, and they speak to other generations sometimes more loudly, sometimes softly. It is unpredictable, but what we do know is they keep on writing, they persist over time, there's a commitment to survive, to prevail, and I think it's fair to say that the canon is much more balanced because of women's studies programs, because of professors like me who were part of the second wave of feminism and really learned a lot about what was lost in the literary tradition, who went to the archives, found writers who had been just sidelined and shelved way in the back, and made them available to subsequent generations. But I think you cannot divorce yourself from gender or race, class, in this political and historical context. Maybe in 100 years, I'm beginning to think no, but I thought so once. I mean, I was thinking that a few months ago, maybe, but I think it's going to take longer than I even imagined, and it won't probably happen in my lifetime. Although, that said, I think women have made enormous strides, and as we have just said, Toni Morrison is probably the best living American writer. That's an enormous step forward, enormous, and you can't take that away.